The council member's voice cut across the town square like a blade. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the ceremony. You're making people uncomfortable." The old man in the stained field jacket didn't move. His hand remained over his heart, eyes fixed on the flag, descending slowly down the pole. What the council member didn't know was that this man had folded that same flag over the coffins of 12 brothers. And in exactly 8 minutes, when someone finally read the name Patch barely visible on his jacket, everything in that town square would change. The morning sun cast long shadows across the memorial wall, where 43 names were etched in black granite. Each name represented a son or daughter of this town who had not come home. The crowd gathered in their Sunday best, children fidgeting in starched shirts, veterans standing at attention in pressed uniforms adorned with medals that caught the light. It was Memorial Day, the same ceremony this town had conducted for 60 years without interruption. But this year, something was different. Standing perhaps 10 feet from the flagpole, close enough to be part of the honor guard but clearly not invited, stood a man who looked like he had crawled out of the woods that morning. His field jacket was military issue. That much was obvious, but the fabric was stained and worn thin at the elbows. His jeans were held up with frayed rope. His boots, once combat grade, now showed more duct tape than leather. His face was weathered beyond his years, deep lines carved by sun and wind, and something heavier than weather. A thick beard, more gray than brown, obscured most of his features. But his eyes, pale blue and distant, never left the flag. The council member, Gerald Winters, had noticed him 20 minutes earlier when setting up the podium. At first, he had assumed the man was simply early for the ceremony, perhaps a homeless veteran seeking a moment of connection. But as the crowd gathered and the man made no move to join them, maintaining his solitary position near the flagpole, Gerald's irritation had grown. This was a dignified ceremony. There were procedures. There were assigned positions for the honor guard, for the color detail, for the distinguished guests. This ragged stranger was disrupting the careful choreography Gerald had planned for weeks. Gerald approached with the confidence of a man who had served on the town council for 12 years and chaired the Memorial Day committee for the last 8. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and spoke in a voice he meant to sound friendly, but came out patronizing. "Sir, the ceremony's about to begin. We need to ask you to join the rest of the attendees behind the rope line. This area is reserved for the official color guard." The old man's hand remained over his heart. He didn't turn his head. He didn't acknowledge the request in any way. His breathing was slow and measured. His stance, despite the worn clothing, held something that made Gerald pause. There was a precision to the way he stood, feet shoulder-width apart, spine straight despite what had to be at least 60 years of gravity. His free hand hung at his side, not quite relaxed, as though ready to snap to attention at any moment. Gerald felt his smile tighten. He glanced back at the crowd. Several people were watching now, their attention drawn away from the mayor's opening remarks. This was exactly what Gerald had wanted to avoid. Disruption, disorder, the appearance of anything less than perfect respect for the fallen. "Sir," he repeated, louder this time, "I need you to move back. Now." The flag reached the halfway point on the pole. The bugler, a young woman from the high school band, raised her instrument. The first notes of taps drifted across the square, mournful and pure. And still the old man did not move. His lips moved slightly, though no sound emerged. If anyone had been close enough, they would have seen he was counting. 1, 2, 3, a name for each beat. 12 names in total. 12 brothers who would never hear these notes again. Gerald's patience, never his strongest quality, evaporated. He reached out and gripped the old man's shoulder, his fingers digging into the worn fabric of the jacket. "You need to leave. Right now, before I call the police." For the first time, the old man moved. His head turned slowly, deliberately, and his pale blue eyes met Gerald's. The intensity in that gaze made Gerald's hand fall away involuntarily. There was no anger there, no defiance, just a depth of exhaustion and sorrow that seemed to have no bottom. The old man's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse, but carrying a weight that made Gerald take an involuntary step back. "With respect, sir, I prefer to stay." The flag continued its descent. The last notes of taps faded into silence. The crowd stood with heads bowed, hands over hearts, unaware of the confrontation unfolding at the edge of their gathering. The mayor finished his remarks about sacrifice and service and the debt that could never be repaid. The color guard began to fold the flag with practiced precision. Gerald felt the eyes of the crowd on him now. A few people had noticed the exchange. He could see old Tom Patterson, veteran of Korea, frowning in their direction. Sarah Chun from the VFW was craning her neck to see what was happening. Gerald's face flushed. This homeless man was making him look foolish in front of the entire town. "If you won't leave voluntarily," Gerald said, his voice rising to carry across the square, "then I have no choice but to ask Officer Morrison to escort you from the premises. This is a sacred ceremony for those who actually serve their country with honor." The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand moved from his heart to his side, where it brushed against something hanging beneath his jacket. Dog tags. The slight metallic clink was barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. His gaze shifted past Gerald to the memorial wall beyond, to the names etched in granite, and his lips moved again in that silent count. Officer Morrison, a young man barely 2 years out of the academy, approached with visible reluctance. He knew Gerald Winters, knew the man's tendency towards self-importance. He also knew, from his training and from his own father's service in the Marines, that you don't judge a veteran by his clothes. But Gerald was counsel, and Morrison was police, and chain of command mattered even in small towns. "Sir," Morrison said, his tone considerably gentler than Gerald's had been, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." The old man finally looked down at his own appearance, as if seeing himself for the first time. The stained jacket, the rope belt, the taped boots. He understood how he looked to these people in their clean clothes and comfortable lives. He had looked at himself the same way every morning for 20 years, in broken mirrors and still puddles, seeing a ghost wearing someone else's skin. But he also understood something they didn't. He understood that the 12 names on that wall, names he whispered every single day, names that were burned into his memory deeper than any tattoo, those names gave him more right to stand at this flagpole than any position on any council ever could. His hand closed around the dog tag beneath his jacket. Not just his own tags. 12 others, strung on the same chain, each one bearing a name that matched the granite wall. 12 brothers who had followed him into an ambush. 12 families who had buried empty caskets because the bodies were too damaged to send home. 12 reasons he had spent 2 decades refusing to accept that he deserved to survive when they had not. "I understand, sir," the old man said quietly. "I'll go." But before he moved, before Officer Morrison could take his arm, before Gerald could claim his small victory, the old man did something that changed everything. He came to attention, not the casual straightening most people attempt. True attention, heels together, feet at 45 degrees, chin level, eyes forward, shoulders back, arms at sides with thumbs along trouser seams. The movement was so precise, so ingrained by decades of muscle memory, that several veterans in the crowd straightened instinctively in response. And in that moment, as the morning sun caught the name patch on his jacket that dirt and time had nearly obscured, Sarah Chun from the VFW saw something that made her blood run cold. 3 letters. Faded almost to nothing, but still there, still legible if you knew to look. 6 hours earlier, the old man had woken to the sound of rain on canvas. His tent, pitched in the thick woods behind the abandoned textile factory on the eastern edge of town, was military surplus from an era when gear was built to last. The fabric was patched in a dozen places, each repair executed with the same meticulous care a surgeon might use on living flesh. Everything in his small camp reflected that same precision. His sleeping bag, rolled tight and secured with paracord. His single cooking pot, cleaned and stored. His few possessions arranged in exact positions that never varied from one day to the next. He rose in the pre-dawn darkness and performed the same ritual he had performed every morning for 7,300 days. 20 years. Not once had he missed. Push-ups first, as many as his aging body would allow. 52 this morning. Down from the 200 he could do at 25, but he wasn't 25 anymore. He was 58, though people often guessed older. Sit-ups next. 75. Then stretches, working through joints that protested more each year, scar tissue from wounds that had never healed quite right pulling tight across his ribs and shoulder. When the physical training was complete, he moved to the second part of the ritual. From a waterproof bag buried beneath his sleeping mat, he extracted a photograph protected in a sealed plastic sleeve. The image was faded, the colors bleached by time and grief, but every face remained clear in his mind, even when he closed his eyes. 13 men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the invincibility of youth. 12 of those faces had been crossed out with permanent marker, a date written beneath each one. March 15th, 2004. The same date for all 12. The only face unmarked was his own, staring back at him with eyes that didn't yet know what it meant to survive. He traced each crossed-out face with his finger, whispering their names like a prayer. Corporal James Whitmore, Private First Class Deshaun Williams, Specialist Ricardo Morales, Lance Corporal Thomas Zobrai. He continued through all 12, the names flowing like water over stones worn smooth by decades of repetition. When he finished, he always added the same words. Still here, brothers. Still trying. Still remembering. The walk to town took 2 hours. 6 miles through back roads and deer trails, avoiding the highway where people might see him, might ask questions, might offer help he knew he didn't deserve. His route took him past the cemetery first. He always stopped at the same spot, a section of newer graves on the eastern hill. 12 headstones in a row, each bearing the insignia of the United States Army and a date of death that matched the photograph he carried. Some had flowers, placed by families who still visited after all these years. Others were bare, except for small American flags planted by the VFW. He knelt before the first stone. Corporal James Whitmore, it read. Beloved son and brother. He died serving his country with honor. The old man's lips moved in silence. I am sorry, Jimmy. I'm so sorry. The same words he had spoken at this grave 2,000 times before. The same words that never felt like enough. The ambush replayed in his mind with the clarity of film, every detail preserved in perfect horror. They had been on patrol in Kinner Province, searching for a Taliban commander intelligence said was holed up in a small village nestled in the mountains. He was the platoon sergeant responsible for these men, for their safety, for bringing them all home. He had walked point that day, his gut telling him something was wrong about the narrow valley they were entering, the village too quiet, the absence of civilians suspicious. He had called a halt, was about to order them to pull back when the world exploded. IED under the lead Humvee, detonating with enough force to flip the threatened vehicle like a toy. Before the echo faded, automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 sides. Ambush. Perfectly executed. They had walked into a kill zone designed by someone who understood tactics, who had studied American patrol patterns, who had been waiting with patience born of certainty. He had returned fire immediately, calling out positions, coordinating his men, trying to establish a defensive perimeter. But they were pinned down in the open with minimal cover. The Humvee was burning. 3 men were down in the first 30 seconds. He called for medevac, for air support, for anything, but the nearest help was 6 hours away, and the Taliban knew it. Private First Class Deshaun Williams had been the youngest, 19 years old. He had been hit in the chest, the round punching through his body armor at an angle the plates couldn't stop. The old man had crawled to him under fire, dragged him behind a boulder that offered scant protection. Williams looked up at him with eyes wide and terrified. Sarge, Williams had whispered. Sarge, I can't breathe. Don't let me die here. Please. He had tried. God, he had tried. Combat first aid, pressure on the wound, screaming into the radio for medevac, for help, for anything. But Williams had drowned in his own blood, while looking into his sergeant's eyes, his last words a gurgling plea for his mother. The old man stood from his knees at the gravestone, his joints cracking, and moved to the next. Specialist Ricardo Morales. Then Lance Corporal Thomas O'Brien. Each grave received the same treatment. A moment of kneeling, a whispered apology, a memory of how they died. O'Brien had taken a round to the throat, bled out in 45 seconds. Sergeant First Class Kenneth Blake had been hit by an RPG. There wasn't enough left to send home in a closed casket. Corporal Austin Mitchell had survived the initial ambush, but died when they tried to move to better cover. Sniper round to the head. Clean. Aston. The old man had been holding his hand. The firefight had lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of hell in a valley that became a graveyard. When reinforcements finally arrived, when the Taliban melted back into mountains like smoke, there were 12 body bags and one sergeant who couldn't understand why he was still breathing. The Army had called him a hero, awarded him the Medal of Honor for holding that position, for calling in danger-close artillery on his own coordinates 3 times, for refusing medevac until every wounded man was evacuated first. They had flown him back to Washington, put him in a dress uniform, hung a blue ribbon around his neck in a White House ceremony. The president had shaken his hand and called him the embodiment of American courage. He had stood at attention and accepted it all while screaming inside. Because heroes save people. Heroes bring their men home alive. What he had done was survive while better men died. After the ceremony, after the parade, after the interviews and the photographs and the politicians using his name to justify policies he didn't understand, he had gone to the funerals. All 12 of them. He had looked into the faces of mothers and fathers and wives and children and seen their grief, their loss, the empty chairs at their tables that would never be filled again. And he had known, with absolute certainty, that he had no right to their gratitude, their handshakes, their tears of pride for their fallen sons. So he had run. Not immediately. First he had tried to go back to duty, to push through, to be the soldier the Army needed. But the nightmares came every night. The sound of Williams begging for his mother. The sight of Blake's body in pieces. The weight of 12 men who had trusted him to keep them safe. He had started drinking to sleep, then drinking to wake up, then just drinking. The Army had tried to help. Counseling, treatment programs, medical discharge with full benefits, and a pension that would have been enough to live comfortably. He had lasted 6 months in civilian life before he couldn't take it anymore. Couldn't take sleeping in a warm bed while his brothers lay in cold ground. Couldn't take eating hot meals while they would never taste anything again. Couldn't take the pity in people's eyes when they learned what he had done, as if surviving was somehow admirable. So one night he had packed a single bag, left his medals in a drawer, and walked away from everything. Away from the VA, away from the benefits, away from anyone who knew his name or his rank or what he had been awarded for the worst day of his life. That had been 20 years ago. He had been 38 then, still young enough to rebuild, still had time to heal, to accept help, to find a way forward. Instead, he had chosen to disappear, to become invisible, to live in the spaces between society where no one asked questions and no one expected answers. He had drifted from town to town for the first few years, but eventually he had found this place. This town where 12 of his men were buried. This town where their names were on a memorial wall. And he had stayed. The sun was fully up now. The old man finished his circuit of the graves and began the final leg of his walk to town. In his pocket, next to the photograph, he carried the dog tags. Not just his own, all 13 sets. His men had been carrying them when they died, but the Army had needed those for identification, for record-keeping, for the bureaucracy of death. So he had ordered replacement sets, every name and number exact, and strung them on a single chain. 12 brothers, 12 weights, 12 reasons he woke up every morning and kept going even though he wanted nothing more than to lie down and not rise. Sarah Chun had been a member of the VFW for 32 years. Ever since she came home from Desert Storm with shrapnel in her leg and memories she preferred not to discuss. She had seen enough veterans in her time to recognize one at 50 paces, regardless of how they dressed or where they slept. It was in the bearing, in the way they moved, in the unconscious habits that years of civilian life could never quite erase. And the old man standing at attention near the flagpole had every marker she had learned to recognize. But there was something else. Something about those 3 letters on his name patch that made her heart skip. She squinted, trying to make out the faded fabric through the crowd and morning light. The first letter was definitely an S. The second looked like an H. The third might be AP. She pulled out her phone, zoomed the camera, and felt the blood drain from her face when the image resolved clearly enough to read. Shop. Not a full name. A call sign. And she knew that call sign. Every veteran who had served in Afghanistan between 2003 and 2005 knew that call sign. It was legendary. It was the kind of story drill sergeants told recruits about what it meant to never leave a fallen comrade. It was the kind of action that got studied at West Point and Ranger School. And the man who earned that call sign had disappeared 20 years ago, vanished so completely that most people assumed he had died. Officer Morrison had his hand on the old man's elbow now, gently but firmly guiding him away from the flagpole. Gerald Winters stood with his arms crossed, satisfaction written across his face, already composing the speech he would give about maintaining standards and dignity at sacred ceremonies. The crowd was beginning to murmur, some in agreement with Gerald's position, others uncomfortable with watching a veteran, homeless or not, being removed from Memorial Day ceremony. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her leg protesting the sudden movement. "Wait," she called out. "Officer Morrison, wait just a moment." Morrison paused, relief crossing his young face. He had not wanted this duty. The old man stopped as well, his gaze still distant, still fixed on something the rest of them could not see. "Sarah," Gerald said with exasperation, "this doesn't concern the VFW. This is a matter of ceremony protocol and public order." "With respect, Gerald," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of military service. "Everything about this ceremony concerns the VFW, and I think you should look at his jacket before you have him removed." Gerald's face flushed. "I've seen his jacket. I've seen his whole appearance. That's precisely the problem." "No," Sarah said quietly. "I don't think you have." She turned to the old man, her voice gentler. "Sir, may I ask what those letters on your patch stand for?" The old man's eyes met hers for the first time. In them she saw recognition, a fellow veteran identifying another, and something else. A weariness so profound it seemed to have weight. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible over the crowd noise. "Shepard," he said. "It was my call sign." The murmuring in the crowd stopped. Several older veterans had heard the exchange. Tom Patterson, who had served in Korea and kept up with military history like some men follow baseball, took a sharp breath. Another man, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, stepped closer. Sarah's hands were shaking. "What unit, sir?" "Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment." The old man recited it without emotion, the words worn smooth by repetition. "March 2004. Sweet Jesus, ton pater son vispirit." He turned to Gerald, his voice shaking with anger. "Do you have any idea what you just done? Do you have any idea who this man is?" Gerald's certainty wavered for the first time. "I don't care who he claims to be. Look at him. This is a distinguished ceremony for honored veterans, not a shelter for vagrants." A new voice cut through the tension. Deep, commanding, carrying the unmistakable ring of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That's enough, Mr. Winters." Colonel Raymond Foster pushed through the crowd, his dress uniform immaculate, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons that spoke of 3 decades of service. He was in town visiting his sister, had come to the ceremony out of respect, and had been watching the confrontation with growing concern. Now he stood face to face with the old man, studying him with the intensity of a commanding officer evaluating a soldier. The old man came to attention automatically, a response so ingrained that 20 years of homelessness couldn't erase it. "Sir," he said quietly. Colonel Foster's eyes moved from the faded name patch to the worn dog tags visible at the old man's collar, to the way he stood, to the scars visible on his weathered hands. "At ease, soldier," Foster said softly. Then, louder, addressing the crowd. "Does anyone here know the story of Kunar Province? March 15th, 2004? Several of the younger attendees shook their heads. But the veterans, the ones old enough to remember the early days of Afghanistan, the ones who had followed the war before it became background noise to civilian life, they knew. Sarah knew. Tom knew. And the looks on their faces made Gerald Winters take an involuntary step backward. 13 men went on patrol that day, Colonel Foster said. Routine mission. Search a village for a Taliban commander. They walked into an ambush that intelligence later determined had been planned for weeks. Kill zone. Three-sided enfilade. IED followed by coordinated small arms fire and RPGs. The nearest support was 6 hours away. The crowd was silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting, sensing the weight of what was being said. 12 men died in that valley, Foster continued. 12 soldiers who were following their platoon sergeant, trusting him to lead them safely, to bring them home. The Taliban had the high ground, had superior numbers, had every advantage. By all rights, it should have been 13 body bags. Gerald's face had gone pale. He glanced at the old man, then quickly away, unable to meet those distant blue eyes. But their platoon sergeant refused to let them die alone, Foster said. He held that position for 6 hours under continuous fire. Called an artillery danger close to his own coordinates 3 times. Took shrapnel from his own supporting fire. Refused medevac until every single wounded man was evacuated. And when reinforcements finally arrived, when the Taliban withdrew, he was still there, still calling out positions, still fighting, still trying to save men who were already gone. Sarah had tears running down her face. Tom Patterson stood at attention, his hand raised in salute. Other veterans in the crowd followed suit. The Army awarded him the Medal of Honor, Foster said. The president hung it around his neck personally, called him the finest example of American courage he had ever met. His photograph hung in the Pentagon. His actions are taught at Officer Candidate School as a textbook example of leadership under fire. Foster turned to face the old man directly. And then Sergeant First Class William Shepard disappeared, walked away from his medal, his pension, his benefits. Nobody could find him. Most people thought he was dead. The old man, Shepard, stood motionless. His jaw was tight. His hands clenched at his sides. He looked like a man who wanted to run, but had forgotten how. Gerald Winters opened his mouth, then closed it, opened it again. I didn't know. He looked like a homeless veteran, Foster finished coldly, which is exactly what he is. But that doesn't change what he did. That doesn't change that 12 families bury their sons because they followed orders, and one man has spent 20 years punishing himself for surviving. Shepard's voice cut through the silence. They shouldn't have followed me, sir. I walked them into that valley. I missed the signs. I should have called retreat sooner. I should have. You did everything humanly possible, Foster interrupted. I read the after-action report. I read the sworn statements from a QRF that arrived. I read the citation for your medal. You held an indefensible position against overwhelming odds because leaving would have meant abandoning your wounded. You called fire on your own location because it was the only way to keep the Taliban from overrunning you. You saved 6 men who would have died without your actions. I lost 12, Shepard said flatly. You kept 6 families from burying their sons, Foster said. You think those 6 men don't think about you? You think they don't wonder where you are, if you're okay, if you're even alive? Shepard's hands were shaking now. He looked at the memorial wall where 12 names were carved. I come here every Memorial Day, he said quietly. Every year for 20 years. I don't ask for anything. I don't tell anyone who I am. I just stand here and remember them. That's all. Just remember. And that's all you should have to do, Sarah said fiercely. She turned to Gerald. You owe this man an apology. Gerald looked like he wanted to disappear. Yes. Of course. Sir, I apologize. I didn't realize. You didn't ask, Tom Patterson said sharply. You just assumed. Assumed that someone who looked down on their luck couldn't possibly deserve respect. The crowd's mood had shifted completely. Where before there had been uncomfortable agreement with Gerald's position, now there was anger directed at him. Parents pulled their children closer, using the moment to teach a lesson about judgment and service. The mayor, who had been silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward with an expression that suggested political calculations were occurring very rapidly. The memory came, without warning, triggered by the word wounded that Colonel Foster had spoken. Shepard was no longer standing in the town square, surrounded by people and flags and ceremony. He was back in the valley, back in the heat and dust and copper smell of blood that no amount of time could erase from his memory. Private First Class Deshaun Williams had been lying behind the boulder, his breathing wet and labored, each exhale bubbling with blood. The kid was 19. 19 years old with a baby daughter he had only seen in photographs because he deployed 2 weeks after she was born. He kept a picture of her in his helmet, changed it every time his wife sent a new one. Shepard had seen him looking at it that morning before the patrol, smiling an image of a little girl who would never remember her father's face. "Sarge," Williams had whispered, his hand gripping Shepard's sleeve with desperate strength. "Sarge, tell my baby girl I love her. Tell her I wanted to come home. Tell her." His words dissolved into coughing, blood spraying from his mouth. Shepard had pressed harder on the wound, his hands already slick and red, knowing it was useless but unable to stop trying. "Stay with me, Williams. Medevac's coming. Just stay with me." But Williams's eyes had already started to glaze. The grip on Shepard's sleeve loosened, and then he was gone, staring at nothing, his last word an attempted whisper of his daughter's name. Aaliyah. Shepard had wanted to scream, had wanted to rage at the sky, at the Taliban fighters still pouring rounds into their position, at the universe that would let a 19-year-old die in the dirt calling for a baby who would grow up without him. But there was no time for grief. Corporal Whitmore was hit. Specialist Morales was down. Sergeant Blake was screaming for ammunition. The firefight was chaos. Textbook ambush, perfectly executed, and Shepard's platoon was caught in the open with minimal cover. He called for air support, for artillery, for anything. The radio operator, Lance Corporal Chun, was working the radio with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the handset. The nearest QRF was 6 hours out. 6 hours. They had minutes. Shepard made the decision that would haunt him for the next 20 years. He called for artillery fire on his own position, gave the coordinates that would drop high explosive rounds within danger-close range, close enough that the shrapnel would hit his own men. But the Taliban was advancing, moving down from the high ground, and in 5 more minutes they would be overrun. Better to die from friendly fire than be captured. Better to go out fighting. The first shells screamed and like the voice of God. The ground erupted in fire and shrapnel and pressure that made his ears bleed. He felt something punch into his shoulder, his ribs, his leg. Felt the heat of metal fragments tearing through flesh. But he stayed on the radio, adjusting fire, calling corrections, directing death onto their position, because it was the only thing keeping the Taliban from finishing them. Corporal Austin Mitchell had been next to him when the third barrage came in. They had been friends since basic training, had deployed together twice, had promised each other they would both make it home. Mitchell had a girl waiting for him in Georgia, a ring already bought, a proposal plan for the day he got off the plane. He talked about her constantly, showed everyone the pictures, made them all promise to attend the wedding. The shell landed 15 meters away, close enough that Shepard felt the heat wash over him, close enough that he was temporarily deafened by the blast, close enough that when he looked over, Mitchell's body was torn open, his blood soaking into the Afghan soil, his eyes still open and staring at the sky. "Not like this," Shepard had whispered, dragging himself to Mitchell's side. "Not you too, brother. Not you." But Mitchell was already gone. Another name to add to the list. Another family to face. Another set of dog tags to carry. The artillery had done its job. The Taliban withdrew, melting back into the mountains, unwilling to advance through the curtain of fire. But the cost had been devastating. When the smoke cleared, when Shepard counted his remaining men, he found 6 still breathing. 6 out of 13. And 4 of those 6 were wounded badly enough that they might not survive the helicopter ride to the field hospital. He had refused medevac when it finally arrived. Refused to leave while his men were still bleeding, still dying, still needing someone to hold their hands and lie to them that everything would be okay. The medics had argued. His own wounds needed treatment, were bleeding through the hasty bandages he had applied. But he would not leave. Not until every one of his men was on a helicopter. Not until the last body bag was loaded. By the time he allowed himself to be evacuated, he had lost so much blood that he coded twice on the flight. They brought him back both times, pumped him full of someone else's blood, stitched his wounds with the kind of field medicine that left scars like railroad tracks across his torso. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Germany with a general standing at his bedside telling him he was a hero. He had tried to explain that heroes do not call artillery on their own men. Heroes do not watch their brothers die. Heroes do not survive when better men do not. But the general had not listened. The medals and commendations were already being processed. The narrative was already being written. Sergeant First Class William Shepard had held an impossible position against overwhelming odds and saved American lives through extraordinary valor. What they did not write in the citation was that he had done it by calling fire that killed 2 of his own men. What they did not mention was that Mitchell and Blake had died from American shrapnel, not Taliban bullets. What they left out was that the 6 men he saved had to step over the bodies of the 12 he lost to reach the helicopters. The Army had investigated, of course, concluded that his decision to call danger close fire had been tactically sound, had likely prevented total loss of the platoon, had been the only option available to him. Concluded that the deaths of Mitchell and Blake, while tragic, were unavoidable casualties of war. Concluded that Sergeant Shepard had acted with distinction and honor. But Shepard knew the truth, knew that he had made a choice to kill some of his men to save others, knew that Mitchell's fiancée would never wear the ring he had bought, knew that Williams's daughter would grow up without a father because her sergeant had walked them into a valley that reeked of ambush from the first step. The ceremony in Washington had been a blur. He had stood at attention in a dress uniform that felt like a costume, accepted a medal that felt like an accusation, shook hands with politicians who knew nothing about what it cost to earn the blue ribbon they hung around his neck. The president had looked him in the eye and called him a hero. Shepard had wanted to vomit. Then came the funerals. 12 of them across 3 weeks. 12 families destroyed. 12 sets of parents who would never see their sons graduate, marry, have children. 12 flag-draped coffins that Shepard helped carry, his shoulders still bandaged from the shrapnel wounds, his ribs taped tight. Williams's mother had collapsed at the graveside, screamed her son's name over and over while Shepard stood at attention and felt every word like a knife. Mitchell's fiancée had thrown the ring into the grave, unable to look at Shepard, unable to speak to the man who had called in the fire that killed her future. Blake's father, himself a veteran of Vietnam, had spit at Shepard's feet and called him a coward for surviving while his son burned. That was when Shepard understood that he could not keep the medal, could not accept the pension, could not live in a world where he was called a hero for the worst failure of his life. So he had waited until the ceremonies were over, until the attention moved on to the next news cycle, and he had disappeared. At first, he had simply driven, put everything he owned in a duffel bag and pointed his truck west, then south, then north, with no destination in mind. He slept in the truck bed, in rest stops, in places where no one would ask his name. He let his hair grow, let his beard cover his face, let himself become unrecognizable. The money ran out after 6 months. He sold the truck, sold everything except the photograph and the dog tags, and started walking. Found day labor when he needed to eat. Slept in shelters when the weather turned. Discovered that invisibility was easier than he thought. That people looked past homeless veterans, saw them as failures, never as the men they had been. He had drifted for years before finding this town. He had not planned to stay. But then he saw the memorial wall, saw 12 names that he knew better than his own, realized that this was where they had been laid to rest, where their families still lived, where their memories were preserved in granite. So he stayed, built his camp in the woods, established his routines, visited the graves every morning and the memorial every Memorial Day, never spoke to anyone, never told his story, just existed in the margins, close enough to honor them, far enough to not intrude on their family's grief. The mayor stepped forward with the calculated expression of a man who suddenly realized he was standing next to a political opportunity. Mayor Richard Blackwell had held office for 8 years through a combination of charm, strategic donations, and an uncanny ability to position himself on the winning side of any issue. He recognized immediately that the mood of the crowd had shifted, that Gerald Winters had become toxic, and that this homeless veteran represented something he could use. "Sergeant Shepard," the mayor said, extending his hand with practiced warmth. "On behalf of this entire community, I want to apologize for how you've been treated today. This is unacceptable. You are a hero, a Medal of Honor recipient, and you deserve our utmost respect." Shepard looked at the extended hand as if it were a weapon. He made no move to take it. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and cold. "I'm not a hero, sir. I'm the man who got 12 soldiers killed." The mayor's smile faltered, but did not fall. He had dealt with difficult personalities before, knew how to pivot. "Nevertheless, your service and sacrifice are beyond question. I would be honored if you would join us for the remainder of the ceremony. In fact, I think you should be the one to raise the flag for the final salute." Shepard's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, I'd rather not." But before the mayor could respond, a woman pushed through the crowd with the kind of determination that suggested she would walk through walls if necessary. She was in her mid-50s, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed but fierce. Her name was Patricia Whitmore, and she had been standing 30 feet away when Colonel Foster revealed who Shepard was. She had been standing there because her son's name was on the memorial wall. Corporal James Whitmore. Kia, March 15, 2004. Age 22. "You," she said, her voice shaking with emotion that could have been anger or grief or both. "You're him. You're Sergeant Shepard." Shepard turned slowly. He recognized her immediately despite the 20 years that had aged them both. He had last seen her at her son's funeral, wearing black, supported by family members, her face a mask of devastation that would haunt his nightmares for decades. He had tried to speak to her then, to offer condolences, to explain. She had not been able to look at him. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm so sorry about Jimmy. I'm so sorry." Patricia Whitmore stared at him for a long moment. The crowd had gone silent again, sensing the weight of whatever was about to happen. Then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into an embrace that he was too shocked to return. "I've been looking for you for 20 years, she whispered against his shoulder. "We all have. All 12 families. We wanted to thank you." Shepard stood rigid, his arms at his sides, his entire body trembling. "Thank me?" The words came out strangled. "Ma'am, I got your son killed. I walked him into an ambush. I called fire that. You kept him from dying alone," Patricia interrupted, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "The Army sent us the after-action report. They told us what you did, how you held my boy while he bled, how you promised him you'd tell me he loved me, how you stayed with him until the end." Tears were streaming down Shepard's weathered face now, the first tears he had allowed himself to shed in front of another person in 20 years. "I couldn't save him," he whispered. "I tried, but I couldn't." "You held my son's hand while he died in a foreign country," Patricia said, her own tears flowing freely now. "You made sure he wasn't alone. You made sure he knew someone cared. That's not failure, Sergeant. That's love." Other people were moving through the crowd now. An older couple, the Williamses, parents of Deshawn. A younger woman with a teenage daughter who had her father's eyes, the family of Ricardo Morales. They had all been there for the ceremony, had all heard Colonel Foster's revelation, and they were all converging on the man who had led their sons and brothers and fathers into battle. Thomas O'Brien's mother reached Shepard next. She was in her 70s now, bent with age and arthritis, but she moved with purpose. She took his hand in both of hers. "My Tom wrote to me about you," she said. "Every letter. Said you were the best sergeant in the Army. Said he'd follow you anywhere." Shepard's voice broke. "He shouldn't have followed me into that valley. He made his own choice," she said firmly. "They all did. They were soldiers. They knew the risks. And according to the reports, you gave them every chance to survive. You called in fire on yourself to save them. You refused to leave until they were all evacuated. You did everything. I should have done more, Shepard said. You did everything humanly possible, Colonel Foster said, moving to join the growing circle around Shepard. I've read the classified reports, Sergeant. I've seen the intelligence assessments. That ambush was planned for weeks. The Taliban knew American patrol patterns, knew the terrain, had fortified positions. You walked into a perfect kill zone, and you still managed to save 6 men who would have died without your leadership. 6 men, Shepard repeated bitterly. Out of 13, 6 families who still have their sons, Patricia Whitmore said. 6 men who went home to their wives and children. 6 futures that exist because you refused to give up. Sarah Chan approached the circle, her phone in her hand. Sergeant Shepard, she said gently, there's something you need to know. Those 6 men you saved? They've been looking for you too. They've got a Facebook group, a network, trying to find any trace of you. They call themselves Shepard 6. Shepard looked at her in disbelief. Why would they want to find me? Because you're the reason they're alive, Sarah said. Because they've spent 20 years wanting to tell you thank you. Because they have children who exist because you held that position. She held out her phone, showing him a Facebook page. 6 profile pictures of middle-aged men, all veterans, all with families visible in their photos. The group description read, looking for SSG William Shepard, Medal of Honor, Charlie Company 2187. If you have any information, please contact us. We owe him everything. Shepard stared at the screen. He recognized the faces despite the years. Specialist Crawford, who had taken shrapnel to the legs. Private Yates, who had been trapped under the burning Humvee until Shepard pulled him out. Corporal Nguyen, who had lost an arm but survived. All alive. All with families. All looking for him. They have children, Sarah said softly. Grandchildren, some of them. All because you wouldn't let them die. Gerald Winters stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his face ashen, watching his carefully ordered ceremony dissolve into something he had not planned and could not control. He had wanted dignity and protocol. What he was getting was raw emotion, genuine connection, and a demonstration of what Memorial Day was actually supposed to honor. Officer Morrison had removed his hand from Shepard's elbow at some point, and now stood at respectful attention, his own eyes wet. The crowd of townspeople, many of whom had agreed with Gerald's initial assessment, now looked ashamed. Children watched in confusion as adults wept openly. The ceremony had been derailed completely, but no one seemed to care. Patricia Whitmore still had her hand on Shepard's arm. You've been punishing yourself for 20 years, she said, hiding from everyone who might help you, running from the people who needed to thank you. But you're here now. You came back to remember them. That has to mean something. Shepard looked at the memorial wall, where 12 names gleamed in the morning sun. I come here every year, he said hoarsely. Every Memorial Day. I stand here and I remember them. All of them. Every face. Every voice. Every last word. Then let us remember them with you, Patricia said. Let's share that burden. You've carried it alone long enough. Around them, the families of the fallen formed a circle. The Williamses, the Morales family, O'Brien's mother, Blake's sister, Mitchell's brother who had been 12 years old when his older brother deployed and never came home. All of them, all 12 families represented, standing around the man who had led their loved ones in a battle and brought back only memories and regret and a medal he had never wanted. Shepard stood in the center of the circle of families, surrounded by people whose lives had been shattered by the same day that had destroyed his, and felt something inside him crack. Not break. Crack. Like ice that had been frozen solid for 20 years, suddenly exposed to warmth it had forgotten existed. The sensation was physically painful, a tightness in his chest that made breathing difficult, a burning behind his eyes that he had spent 2 decades learning to suppress. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the dog tags beneath his worn jacket. 13 sets of tags, metal on metal, the weight he carried everywhere. Patricia Whitmore noticed the gesture and understood immediately what he was touching. May I see them? She asked quietly. Please. Shepard's hand stilled. For 20 years he had kept the tags hidden, a private penance that no one else needed to witness. But something in Patricia's voice, in the gentle request rather than a demand, made him slowly pull the chain from beneath his jacket. The tags came out in a cascade of metal, catching the sunlight, each one stamped with a name and service number and blood type and religion. 13 lives reduced to metal rectangles. Patricia reached out with trembling fingers and found her son's tag among the others. Whitmore James Serre. Oppositif. Methodist. She traced the letters with her thumb, the same gesture Shepard had performed thousands of times in the darkness of his tent. She pressed the tag to her lips, then to her heart, and when she looked up at Shepard, her face was transformed by something that looked almost like peace. "You've been carrying him all this time," she whispered. "You never let him go." "I couldn't," Shepard said, his voice breaking completely now. "I promised him I'd tell you he loved you. I promisa ide ramambe. I promised I wouldn't leave him behind. And you kept that promise," Patricia said. "Every single day, for 20 years, you kept that promise." The other families were reaching for the tags now, each finding their own son or brother or father among the metal rectangles. Deshaun Williams's mother let out a sob when she found her boy's tag. Thomas O'Brien's elderly mother clutched his tag to her chest and closed her eyes. Ricardo Morales' daughter, a teenager who had never known her father, touched his tag with reverent fingers and whispered "Papa," as if the word itself was a prayer. "This is what you've been carrying," Colonel Foster said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not just the memory, not just the guilt. You've been carrying them. All of them. Every day." Shepard could not speak. His throat had closed completely. He stood there in his ragged clothes and taped boots, surrounded by the families of the men he had failed, holding tags that represented everything he had lost, and felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. Sarah Chan was watching him closely with the practiced eye of someone who had seen combat trauma in all its forms. She recognized the signs of a man on the edge of either breakthrough or breakdown. She stepped closer, her voice low and urgent. "Sergeant, when was the last time you ate a real meal? When was the last time you slept somewhere warm? When was the last time you accepted help from anyone?" Shepard shook his head, unable to find words. The questions felt like attacks, even though they were spoken with kindness. Accepting help meant admitting he deserved it, and he had spent 20 years convinced that he deserved nothing but the cold ground and the weight of dog tags and the daily pilgrimage to graves. "You've been trying to die without dying," Colonel Foster said bluntly. "Living just enough to keep breathing, just enough to visit the graves, just enough to punish yourself. But that's not what they would have wanted. You know that, don't you?" Shepard's eyes moved to the memorial wall. 12 names. 12 faces he saw every time he closed his eyes. "I don't know what they would have wanted," he said hoarsely. "I only know what they didn't get. They didn't get to come home. They didn't get to have families. They didn't get to grow old. But they got you," Patricia Whitmore said firmly. "They got a leader who fought for them, who held them when they were dying, who promised to remember them, and actually kept that promise. My Jimmy wrote in his last letter that if anything happened to him, he was glad you were his sergeant, that he trusted you with his life." Shepard flinched as if struck. "But I failed that trust." "You honored it," Patricia corrected. "You did everything you could, and then you spent 20 years making sure they weren't forgotten. How's that failure?" A younger man pushed through the crowd, moving with urgency. He was in his early 40s, fit and military and bearing despite civilian clothes. His face was weathered by sun and stress, marked with scars that spoke of combat. When he reached the circle around Shepard, he stopped abruptly, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sarge," the word came out choked. "Is that really you?" Shepard turned, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. Crawford. Specialist Jason Crawford, who had taken shrapnel to both legs during the ambush, who had screamed for his mother while Shepard applied tourniquets, who had survived because Shepard refused to let him bleed out in the Afghan dirt. "Crawford," Shepard breathed. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," Crawford said, tears already streaming down his face. "We've all been looking for you. For 20 goddamn years we've been looking for you." He crossed the distance in 3 strides and grabbed Shepard in an embrace that nearly knocked the older man off his feet. Shepard stood rigid, arms at his sides, overwhelmed by the physical contact, by the emotion radiating from this man he had last seen being loaded onto a medevac helicopter. "You saved my life," Crawford said against Shepard's shoulder. "You pulled me out of the kill zone. You stopped the bleeding. You called in the birds. I've got 2 kids and 3 grandchildren who exist because you wouldn't let me die. I got you shot," Shepard said. "I walked you into that ambush. You led us into a mission." Crawford pulled back, gripping Shepard's shoulders hard. "The Taliban set the ambush. The intelligence was bad. You did everything right. Everything. And when it went to hell, you saved everyone you could save." He gestured to others in the crowd, pointing to faces Shepard had not noticed. "There. That's Nguyen. Lost his arm, but he's alive. He's a teacher now. Has 2 adopted kids. And there's Yates. You pulled him out from under the burning Humvee. He's a firefighter, ironically enough. Married, 3 kids." Shepard's vision was blurring. He could see the men Crawford was pointing to, could recognize their faces beneath the years and the civilian lives they had built. All alive. All here. All looking at him with expressions he could not interpret. "We tried everything to find you," Crawford continued. "Filed missing persons reports. Contacted the VA. Hired private investigators. You disappeared so completely it was like you died. But we never stopped looking. Never stopped hoping." "Why?" Shepard managed to ask. "Why would you want to find me?" Crawford's laugh was half-sob. "Are you serious? Sarge, you're the reason we're standing here. The reason we got to go home. The reason we got to have lives. We wanted to thank you. We wanted to tell you that what you did mattered." Shepard shook his head violently. "What I did was survive while better men died." "Better men?" Nguyen had pushed forward now, his prosthetic arm visible in his short-sleeved shirt. "Sarge, Williams was 19. O'Brien was 20. They were kids. Good kids, brave kids, but they were following orders. You were the one making impossible choices under fire. You were the one calling in artillery on your own position to save us. Don't you dare call them better men." The circle of people around Shepard had grown larger. Townspeople who had initially agreed with Gerald Winters' assessment now stood in shame, recognizing what they had almost driven away. Children watched in confusion as their parents wept. Veterans stood at attention, recognizing one of their own finally being seen. Shepard felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him like physical force. He could walk away right now, could pull free from Crawford's grip, push through the crowd, disappear back into the woods where he had lived in careful isolation. He had done it before, could do it again. These people would forget, would return to their lives, would move on. He could go back to his tent, his rituals, his daily penance of visiting graves and whispering apologies to the dead. But his feet would not move. His legs had turned to stone. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the guilt and shame and 20 years of self-imposed exile, a small voice asked a question he had been avoiding since the moment Patricia Whitmore wrapped her arms around him. What they're right? What if running is the betrayal, not surviving? The thought was terrifying. If he accepted their forgiveness, their gratitude, their help, then he had to accept that he deserved those things. And accepting that meant confronting the possibility that he had wasted 20 years punishing himself for doing exactly what he was trained to do. Making impossible choices in impossible situations, leading men into danger, bringing home everyone he could. His hand moved to the photograph in his pocket, the one he had carried since the day after the ambush. 13 faces, 12 crossed out. His thumb traced the X marks he had drawn in permanent ink, one for each funeral, each line a promise that he would never forget. But looking at it now, surrounded by the families of those crossed-out faces, he saw something he had missed for 2 decades. The faces were smiling, laughing, arms around each other. Brothers. They had been alive in that moment, fully alive, and they had trusted him. Sarah Chun moved closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Sergeant, I run a reintegration program through the VFW. It's not the VA. No bureaucracy, no paperwork nightmares, no being lost in the system. Just a place where combat veterans can talk to people who understand. We've got housing, job placement, counseling if you want it. No pressure, no judgment. Just help." Shepard's automatic response formed on his lips. No thank you, ma'am. I'm Ufine. The same words he had used for 20 years when shelter workers or concerned citizens had offered assistance. The same polite refusal that kept him isolated, kept him safe from the possibility of connection, kept him locked in his self-imposed prison. But Crawford's hand was still on his shoulder. Patricia Whitmore was still holding his dog tags. The families of 12 dead soldiers were still standing around him with expressions that looked less like grief and more like hope. And the words that came out of his mouth were not the ones he had planned. I don't know if I can, he said, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I deserve to. It's not about deserving, Colonel Foster said. It's about surviving. You survived, Sergeant. That's not a crime. It's not a failure. It's just what happened. And what you do with that survival, that's the choice you get to make. Shepard looked at the memorial wall again. 12 names. 12 promises. I told them I'd remember, he said. Every day, I remember. If I leave here, if I accept help, if I try to build something, what if I forget them? Patricia Whitmore stepped directly in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. My son has been dead for 20 years, she said. 20 years of me waking up and remembering he's gone. 20 years of holidays without him, birthdays without him, graduations and weddings and grandchildren he'll never meet. Do you think I need you living in a tent to remember him? The words hit Shepard like a slap. He started to protest, but Patricia continued, her voice fierce with emotion that was definitely not anger, but something deeper and more complex. You think honoring the dead means suffering, she said. But Jimmy wouldn't want that. None of them would want that. They were soldiers. They understood sacrifice. They understood risk. They made their choices, and they paid the price. But you're still here, still breathing, still capable of having a life. And you're choosing to waste it because you think suffering is the same as remembering. I'm not wasting it, Shepard said. I visit them every day. I keep their tags. I make sure they're not forgotten. You're existing, not living, Crawford interjected. Sarge, I've got a daughter who just graduated from college. My son's getting married next month. I've got grandkids who climb on me and call me Papa. All of that exists because you held that position, because you called in fire when you had to, because you saved my life. And you're telling me that your life, the life you saved along with mine, that life isn't worth living? Shepard's throat had closed again. He could not speak without his voice breaking, could not defend his choices without admitting they were choices. For 20 years he had told himself he was honoring the dead. But standing here, looking at families who had suffered far more than he had, who had lost sons and brothers and fathers while he had only lost his sense of worth, he saw his isolation for what it really was. Not honor, not remembrance, just fear. Fear of moving forward. Fear of joy. Fear of discovering that life could continue after catastrophic loss. The mayor, who had been watching this exchange with calculating eyes, chose this moment to interject. Sergeant Shepard, I think I speak for the entire town when I say we would be honored to help you. We can arrange housing, assistance, whatever you need. Shepard looked at him with flat, tired eyes. With respect, sir, I don't need your help. I don't need anything from you. The mayor blinked, taken aback. The calculated warmth in his expression flickered. But surely, you wanted me gone 20 minutes ago, Shepard said quietly. Now you want to help because it looks good. Because people are watching. But I've been in this town for 20 years. 20 years of walking these streets, sleeping in these woods, and nobody saw me. Nobody helped. So forgive me if I don't trust your sudden concern. The mayor's face flushed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah Chun cut him off smoothly. The VFW's offer stands regardless, she said. No politics, no photo opportunities, just veterans helping veterans. When you're ready, if you're ready, the door's open. Shepard nodded slowly. He looked at Crawford, at the other survivors he could now see in the crowd, at the families of the fallen standing in a circle of shared grief and impossible grace. These people were offering him something he had not allowed himself to want in 2 decades. Not just food or shelter or warm beds. They were offering him permission to live, to stop punishing himself, to accept that survival was not betrayal, but accepting that meant letting go of the weight. meant removing the chain of dog tags that he had carried for 7,300 days, meant walking away from the tent in the woods and the daily visits to graves and the careful rituals that had structured his entire existence, meant risking the possibility that if he stopped suffering, he might forget the faces of the men who had no choice but to stop breathing. He pulled the photograph from his pocket one more time, looked at the 13 faces, 12 crossed out. The 13th face, his own, stared back at him from 20 years ago. Younger, unbroken, still certain that he could bring everyone home if he just made the right choices. That version of himself was gone, had died in the valley with his men, even though his body kept walking. But maybe there was a version of himself that could exist in the space between the dead and the living. Not the man he had been, but not the ghost he had become. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "I don't know how to stop carrying them." "You don't stop," Patricia Whitmore said gently. "You just learn to carry them differently. Not as weights dragging you down, but as memories lifting you up." My Jimmy loved life, loved laughing, loved his friends, loved serving. He wouldn't want you in the dirt. He'd want you standing, fighting, living. Shepard closed his eyes, saw Williams's face as he died, saw Mitchell torn apart by shrapnel, saw all 12 of them frozen forever at the ages they had been when they fell. And then, for the first time, he let himself see something else. He saw Crawford's grandchildren, saw Nguyen's adopted kids, saw Yates pulling people from burning buildings, saw the ripples of life that continued because of choices made in hell. Gerald Winters had been standing at the edge of the crowd for the past 10 minutes, watching his carefully planned ceremony transform into something he no longer recognized or controlled. His face had cycled through shame, anger, defensiveness, and finally settled into something that looked almost like understanding. He was not a cruel man, not truly. He was simply a man who valued order and appearance over substance, who had confused dignity with exclusion, who had never served in the military and therefore had never understood what service actually cost. Now, watching Shepard surrounded by the families of the fallen, watching grown men weep openly, watching survivors embrace their former sergeant with desperate gratitude, Gerald felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It might have been guilt. It might have been recognition of his own smallness. Whatever it was, it compelled him forward when every instinct told him to retreat. He approached the circle slowly, aware that he was the last person who had any right to speak. Officer Morrison stepped aside to let him through, and suddenly Gerald was face to face with Shepard, close enough to see the weathered lines of the older man's face, the scars barely visible beneath the beard, the eyes that had seen things Gerald could never imagine. "Sergeant Shepard," Gerald began, then stopped. His prepared apology, the one he had been rehearsing in his head, suddenly felt inadequate. Words about misunderstandings and protocols seemed obscene in the context of what he now understood. He tried again. "I was wrong. Not just wrong about you specifically, but wrong about what this ceremony is supposed to be." Shepard looked at him without expression, waiting. "I've been running this Memorial Day event for 8 years, Gerald continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. "And I've been doing it wrong the entire time. I've been focused on appearances, on making it look dignified and proper, on keeping it clean and organized and comfortable for the people attending. But that's not what Memorial Day is about, is it?" "No, sir," Shepard said quietly. "It's not. It's about them," Gerald said, gesturing to the memorial wall. "It's about the people who didn't come home, and about the people like you who carry them, who remember them, who live with the weight of their loss every single day. And I almost had you removed from a ceremony that exists because of men like them, because you didn't look the way I thought you should look." The apology hung in the air. Shepard studied Gerald for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Apology accepted, sir." "You didn't know." "That's not an excuse," Gerald said. "I should have asked, should have listened, should have seen past the surface." His voice dropped lower. "My father was a veteran. Cordell. He never talked about it. Died 10 years ago, and I never asked him about his service. Never thought it mattered. I think I understand now why he kept quiet." Shepard's expression softened slightly. "Some things are hard to talk about," he said. "Doesn't mean they don't matter." Colonel Foster stepped forward, his command voice cutting through the emotional moment with the precision of someone used to redirecting energy into action. "We're losing focus here," he said. "We have a ceremony to complete, and I think Sergeant Shepard should be the one to complete it." All eyes turned to Shepard, who immediately began shaking his head. "Sir, I can't. I'm not." "You're exactly who should do it," Foster interrupted. "You're the one who's been coming here for 20 years. You're the one who knows every name on that wall. You're the one who's earned the right." Sarah Chun was nodding in agreement. "The ceremony got interrupted anyway," she said. "Let's finish it the right way, with someone who actually understands what we're honoring." The crowd began to murmur in agreement. Patricia Whitmore touched Shepard's arm gently. "Please," she said, "for them, for my Jimmy and all the others. Let them see that we honor all veterans, not just the ones who look like we expect them to look." Shepard looked around at the faces watching him. The families of the fallen, the survivors who had spent 20 years searching for him, the townspeople who had witnessed his humiliation transform into vindication, the children who were learning a lesson their parents had nearly failed to teach. And standing at the back, barely visible, he saw other homeless men and women he recognized from the shelters, from the soup kitchens, from the invisible margins where people like him existed. They were watching too, perhaps wondering if this moment meant something for them as well. "I haven't led a ceremony in 20 years, Shepard said, his voice hoarse. "I don't remember the protocols." "You remember more than you think," Colonel Foster said, "and we'll be right there with you." Shepard closed his eyes, took a deep breath, felt the weight of 13 sets of dog tags against his chest, felt the photograph in his pocket, felt 20 years of isolation and guilt and self-imposed punishment pressing down on him. And then he felt something else. Crawford's hand on his shoulder, Patricia's fingers still touching his arm. The presence of people who wanted him to stand, to lead, to live. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, I'll do it." The crowd parted to let him through to the flagpole. His legs felt unsteady and used to being the center of attention, and used to walking towards something instead of away from it. But he made it to the base of the pole, where the color guards stood at attention. Young men and women in crisp uniforms who had been waiting patiently for the ceremony to resume. The flag had been folded during the interruption, held now by the young woman from the high school band who had played taps. She looked at Shepard with wide eyes, taking in his worn clothes and weathered face, clearly uncertain about handing over the flag to someone who looked like he had been living in the woods. But Colonel Foster nodded to her, and she extended the flag toward Shepard with trembling hands. Shepard took the flag with the reverence of someone handling sacred relics. His hands knew what to do, even though his mind had forgotten the conscious steps. 20 years of muscle memory took over. He held the flag correctly, supported it properly, his bearing shifting subtly from homeless man to soldier. The crowd had gone quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Not uncomfortable or tense, but expectant. Waiting. Sarah Chun raised her phone to record the moment. Crawford stood at attention. Patricia Whitmore had her hand over her heart. Even Gerald Winters had straightened his posture, recognizing that he was witnessing something he had never actually seen in his 8 years of running these ceremonies. Chinwinonor. Shepard turned to face the memorial wall, where 43 names were etched in granite. His eyes found the 12 names he knew by heart, could recite in order, had whispered every single day for 20 years. And in a voice that started quiet but grew stronger with each word, he began to speak. "I stand here representing all who serve," he said. The words came from memory, from ceremonies he had participated in decades ago, from training that had been burned into him at Fort Benning a lifetime ago. "I speak for those who cannot speak. I remember those who cannot be forgotten. I honor those who gave everything so that others might live in freedom." His voice cracked on the last words, but he pushed through. Behind him, veterans were coming to attention. Hands moved to cover hearts. Children stopped fidgeting. The moment stretched out, heavy with meaning that transcended the words being spoken. Shepard raised the flag slightly, preparing to unfold it for the final raising. But before he could continue, he did something that was not part of any protocol he had ever learned. He turned to face the crowd and spoke directly to them in his own words, not the scripted ceremony language. Every name on this wall was someone's son, he said, someone's brother, someone's father. They were real people with real lives and real futures that ended too soon. And when we honor them, we're not honoring heroes in the abstract. We're honoring Jimmy Whitmore, who wanted to be a teacher. We're honoring Deshaun Williams, who had a baby daughter. We're honoring all of them as the people they were, not just the sacrifice they made. Shepard's hands moved with practiced precision as he began to unfold the flag. The color guard stepped forward to assist, but Colonel Foster raised a hand to stop them. "Let him do it," Foster said quietly. "This is his moment." The young service members stepped back, standing at attention, watching as this weathered homeless man performed the ceremony with a grace that spoke of decades of military bearing. The flag unfurled in the morning breeze, red and white stripes rippling, the blue field with its stars catching the sunlight. Shepard attached it to the halyard with movements so automatic they seemed choreographed. His fingers worked the clips and knots without conscious thought, muscle memory from 1,000 flag details performed over a career that had ended 20 years ago but had never truly left his body. As he began to raise the flag, he spoke again, his voice carrying across the silent square. "I knew 12 of these names personally," he said. Corporal James Whitmore, Private First Class Deshaun Williams, Specialist Ricardo Morales. He continued through all 12, each name spoken with clarity and weight, each syllable a small act of remembrance. Patricia Whitmore was weeping openly now, but her tears seemed different from the grief Shepard had witnessed at the funerals. These tears looked almost like healing. Around her, the other families of the fallen stood with expressions that mirrored hers. Pain and loss mixed with something that might have been gratitude that someone still remembered their loved ones not as names on granite, but as people who had lived. "They were my brothers," Shepard continued as the flag rose slowly up the pole. "They trusted me to lead them. They follow me into hell because that's what soldiers do. They trusted their sergeant, and I failed them." "No," Patricia said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "No, you didn't fail them." But Shepard kept speaking, needing to finish what he had started. "I called an artillery fire that killed 2 of my own men because it was the only way to save the others. I made a choice that haunts me every single day. I survived when better men didn't. And for 20 years, I've been trying to understand why I deserve to live when they deserved it more." The flag reached the top of the pole, fully extended now, waving in the breeze above the memorial and the gathered crowd. Shepard secured the halyard and stepped back, coming to attention with his hand over his heart. The position was perfect, parade ground precise, the stance of a soldier who had done this 1,000 times. "But you're wrong about one thing," Colonel Foster said, stepping forward to stand beside Shepard. "You didn't deserve to live more than they did. None of you deserve to die. War doesn't work that way. It's not about deserving. It's about chaos and chance and impossible choices. You survived because of luck and skill and the grace of God. Not because you were better, not because you deserved it more, just because you did." Shepard's hand remained over his heart, but his eyes had closed. Tears tracked down his weathered face, disappearing into his gray beard. "I see their faces every night," he said. "Every time I close my eyes. Williams looking up at me, begging me to tell his baby girl he loved her. Mitchell torn apart by shrapnel I called in. Blake burning. O'Brien bleeding out. All of them. Every single night for 20 years. Then let them see you standing," Crawford said, moving to Shepard's other side. "Let them see you honoring them. Let them see you living the life they didn't get to live. Because I promise you, Sarge, wherever they are, they're not angry that you survived. They're grateful you were there when they died. That they didn't die alone. That someone held them and promised to remember." The crowd began to shift. One by one, every veteran present came to attention and rendered a salute. Tom Patterson, Korea veteran, his arm rock steady despite his age. Sarah Chun, Desert Storm, standing straight despite the shrapnel still in her leg. The younger veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan, recognizing one of their own. Even Officer Morrison, who had never deployed but understood respect when he saw it. Then the non-veterans began to stand, hands over hearts, children mimicking their parents, everyone in the square rising in a wave of recognition and honor. Not for the medal Shepard had been awarded, not for the rank he had held, but for the man standing before them who had carried his brothers for 20 years and finally allowed himself to be seen. The mayor stepped forward, his earlier opportunism replaced by something that looked genuine. "Sergeant Shepard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say we've been conducting this ceremony wrong. We've been honoring the abstract idea of sacrifice without honoring the actual people who sacrificed. You've shown us what this day is really supposed to be about." Shepard opened his eyes, looking out at the crowd of standing people, at the salutes and the hands over hearts, at the families of the fallen watching him with expressions he could finally allow himself to interpret as something other than blame. For the first time in 20 years, he saw the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had not failed as completely as he believed. Sarah Chan approached with her phone still raised, recording. "Sergeant," she said gently, "I'd like your permission to share this. To let people know you've been found. To let Shepard's 6 know you're here. To let other veterans who might be struggling know that it's never too late to accept help." Shepard looked at the phone, at the camera recording this moment of vulnerability and recognition. For 20 years, he had hidden from cameras, from recognition, from anything that might identify him. But standing here with the flag flying above him and his brothers' names carved in stone behind him, he understood that hiding had not honored them. It had only prolonged his own suffering. "You can share it," he said quietly. "Tell them I'm sorry it took so long. Tell them I'm trying to do better." The bugler raised her instrument again, and this time, when taps played, everyone in the square stood in absolute silence. The mournful notes drifted across the memorial, across the town, carrying with them the weight of all the names on the wall and all the stories behind those names. Shepard stood at attention throughout, his bearing perfect, his hand over his heart, his eyes fixed on the 12 names he had carried for so long. When the last note faded, Colonel Foster spoke in his command voice. "Present arms." Every military person in the crowd snapped to salute position. Shepard, after a moment's hesitation, joined them, rendering a salute to the flag and to the memory of the fallen. His arm was steady despite everything, muscle memory overriding emotion, training asserting itself over trauma. "Order arms," Foster commanded, and the salutes came down in unison. Shepard's arm dropped to his side, but he remained at attention, unwilling to break the moment, unwilling to step away from this position he had avoided for 2 decades. Patricia Whitmore approached him slowly, careful not to startle him. She held something in her hands, a small American flag, the kind placed on graves. "Sergeant Shepard," she said, "I've been placing this flag on my son's grave every Memorial Day for 20 years. But I think it belongs with you now. I think Jimmy would want you to have it." Shepard looked at the flag, at the small wooden stick and the fabric that represented everything he had fought for and everything he had lost. His hands shook as he accepted it, holding it with the same reverence he had shown the larger flag moments before. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "My son died believing you were the best leader he ever had," Patricia said. "He wrote that in his last letter home. Said if anything happened, he was glad you were his sergeant. So yes, you deserve this. You deserve to know that your men trusted you, but they didn't blame you, that they would be proud of you for finally accepting help." Shepard clutched the small flag to his chest, and something inside him that had been frozen for 20 years finally, completely broke. Not a crack this time, a break. The walls he had built around his grief and guilt came crashing down, and he sobbed openly, standing in the center of the town square in his ragged clothes, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him but chose grace instead. Crawford did not let Shepard fall. When the sobs came, when 20 years of suppressed grief finally broke through, Crawford wrapped his arms around his former sergeant and held him upright. Nguyen joined him on the other side, his prosthetic arm and his remaining arm both supporting the man who had saved his life. Yates pushed through the crowd to add his strength to theirs. The 6 survivors of Charlie Company, scattered across the country for 2 decades, had finally found their sergeant and they would not let him collapse under the weight he had carried alone for so long. "Let it out, Sarge," Crawford said quietly. "We've got you. We're not going anywhere." The crowd watched in silence as this weathered homeless man, this Medal of Honor recipient, this leader who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, finally allowed himself to grieve in front of witnesses. His sobs were raw and painful, the sound of a dam breaking after holding back an ocean. Every eye in the square was wet. Parents pulled their children close, using the moment to teach lessons about sacrifice and service and the cost of war that could never be fully repaid. Sarah Chun stood with her phone raised, recording everything, understanding that this moment needed to be preserved. Not for exploitation, not for viral sensation, but for the thousands of veterans who were living in tents and under bridges and in the margins of society, punishing themselves for surviving when others did not. They needed to see that acceptance was possible, that healing could begin even after decades. That it was never too late to come home. Colonel Foster waited until Shepard's sobs began to quiet before speaking again. His voice carried the weight of command, but also something softer, something that sounded like understanding born of his own experience. "Sergeant Shepard," he said, "I want to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear." Shepard raised his head from Crawford's shoulder, his face wet with tears, his eyes red and exhausted. "Sir, you're not the only one who's been carrying this," Foster said. "Those 6 men you saved, they've spent 20 years wondering if you were alive, wondering if you blamed yourself, wondering if they could have done something to help you. They've carried guilt too. Guilt that they survived because you made the choices you made. Guilt that you disappeared and they couldn't find you. Guilt that they got to have families and lives while you were suffering alone." Shepard looked at Crawford, at Nguyen, at Yates. "Is that true?" Crawford's voice was rough. "Sarge, I named my son after you. William Crawford. He's 16 now. I wanted him to carry the name of the man who gave me the chance to be a father. And every year on his birthday, I wondered where you were. If you were okay. If you knew how grateful I was. I've got 2 adopted kids from Afghanistan," Nguyen said. "A brother and sister whose parents were killed in the war. I brought them home because you taught me that every life matters. That we fight for people, not for politics. You gave me that. You gave me the life that allowed me to give them a life." Yates stepped forward. "I'm a firefighter because of you, Sarge. Because you ran in a fire to pull me out from under that Humvee. Because you showed me what it means to risk everything for someone else. I've pulled 17 people from burning buildings. 17 lives saved because you saved mine first." Shepard stood trembling, held upright by his men, listening to the ripples of his survival cascade outward in ways he had never allowed himself to imagine. Every child these men had fathered or adopted. Every life saved by Yates. Every student taught by Nguyen. Every act of kindness or courage or simple daily existence that flowed from the choice Shepard had made to hold that position, to call that fire, to refuse to abandon his men. Patricia Whitmore moved closer, her hands still holding the dog tags she had found among the 13 hanging from Shepard's neck. She had been listening to everything, watching this man who had let her son finally allow himself to be seen in his entirety. Now she spoke with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years learning to live with unbearable loss. "My son died at 22, she said. "He never got to have children, never got to have the life these men have had. And I won't lie to you, Sergeant. That hurts. It will hurt until the day I die. But you know what will hurt more? Knowing that you threw away your life because he lost his. Knowing that the man who held my boy when he died, who promised to remember him, who carried his tags for 20 years, that man chose to waste the survival my son didn't get." She held up the dog tag with her son's name. "Jimmy trusted you," she said. "He followed you because he believed in you. And if he could speak to you now, if he could tell you anything, I know what he'd say. He'd say thank you for trying to save him. Thank you for not leaving him alone. Thank you for remembering." And then he'd tell you to get your act together and live the life he didn't get to live. Not waste it. Live it. The words hit Shepard like physical blows, each one landing with the force of truth he had spent 20 years running from. His voice, when he found it, was barely a whisper. I don't know how. You start by accepting help, Sarah Chan said, stepping forward with practical purpose cutting through the emotion. You start by coming with me to the VFW. We've got a room ready. We've got food. We've got people who understand combat trauma, who won't judge you, who will just be present. You don't have to commit to anything beyond tonight. Just one night in a warm bed instead of that tent. Shepard looked toward the woods where his camp waited, where his carefully ordered life of isolation and penance had been structured for 2 decades. Everything he owned was there. The tent, the sleeping bag, the photograph in its waterproof sleeve, his routines, his rituals, his control over his own suffering. But Crawford's hand was still on his shoulder. Patricia still held the dog tags. The families of 12 fallen soldiers still stood in a circle around him, offering something he had never thought he deserved. And looking at their faces, at the hope in their eyes, at the possibility that his acceptance of help might somehow honor the dead rather than betray them, Shepard felt his resistance crumbling. One night, he said quietly, "I could try one night." The relief on Sarah's face was immediate. "One night is perfect. We'll go get your things from your camp. You don't have to leave anything behind. We'll bring it all to the VFW, get sorted, get you settled." The mayor, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the circle, spoke up. "The town will cover any costs. Medical care, dental work, whatever he needs. It's the least we can do." Gerald Winters, standing next to the mayor, nodded vigorously. "And I'll personally ensure that Sergeant Shepard has a place of honor at every future Memorial Day ceremony. If he's willing." His voice dropped. "If he can forgive my ignorance." Shepard looked at Gerald, seeing not the pompous council member who had tried to have him removed, but a man struggling with his own recognition of failure. "Forgiveness comes easier when you stop holding grudges," he said quietly. "I learned that the hard way, or I'm trying to learn it." Colonel Foster addressed the crowd, his command voice bringing order to the emotional chaos. "This ceremony today didn't go as planned," he said, "but I think it went exactly as it needed to go. We've all learned something about judgment, about service, about what it really means to honor the fallen. Sergeant Shepard has shown us that heroes don't always look like we expect them to look. That sacrifice continues long after the battle ends. That remembering the dead isn't about ceremonies and flags. It's about carrying them in our hearts and our actions every single day." The crowd erupted in applause. Not polite ceremonial clapping, but genuine, sustained recognition. Shepard stood in the center of it, overwhelmed, his men holding him steady, the families of the fallen smiling through their tears, and for the first time in 20 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe his survival meant something beyond guilt and punishment. 3 hours later, Shepard sat in a chair at the VFW hall, his possessions from the tent spread on the table before him. It was a pitiful collection for 20 years of life. The tent itself, patched and repatched. The sleeping bag, military surplus from an era long past. The single cooking pot, a change of clothes. The photograph in its waterproof sleeve. And the 13 sets of dog tags, still hanging from the chain around his neck. Sarah Chan sat across from him, not pushing, not questioning, just present. She had served in Desert Storm, had her own scars both visible and hidden, and she understood that healing could not be rushed. Around them, the VFW hall hummed with quiet activity. Other veterans moved through the space, some helping prepare the room Shepard would sleep in, others cooking food in the kitchen, all of them giving him space while making it clear he was not alone. Crawford had stayed, along with Nguyen and Yates. The 3 of them sat nearby, talking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing over to make sure their sergeant was still there, still real, still breathing. Patricia Whitmore had gone home to call the other families, to spread the word that Shepard had been found, that he was accepting help, that maybe the healing they had all needed for 20 years could finally begin. The door opened, and Tom Patterson walked in, the Korea veteran who had been at the ceremony. He carried a duffel bag and moved with the careful stiffness of a man in his 90s. He approached Shepard's table and set the bag down gently. "Heard you might need some clothes," Tom said. "These belong to my son. He was about your size. Passed away last year. Cancer. He was a Marine. Served in the first Gulf War. would have been honored to know they were going to a Medal of Honor recipient. Shepard looked at the bag, at this offering from a stranger who had witnessed his humiliation and vindication. "Sir, I can't take your son's clothes." "Yes, you can," Tom said firmly. "He's gone. You're here. And he always said we'd take care of our own. You're one of our own, whether you've been accepting it or not." Sarah helped Shepard open the bag. Inside were jeans, shirts, a warm jacket, all in good condition, all clean and folded with military precision. At the bottom was a challenge coin from the 1st Marine Division. Tom picked it up and pressed it into Shepard's palm. "That was his most prized possession," Tom said. "He carried it through Desert Storm. Now I'm giving it to you. Not because you need another piece of metal, but because you need to understand something. This community, this brotherhood of veterans, we don't leave people behind. We failed you for 20 years by not seeing you. We're not failing you anymore." Shepard closed his fingers around the coin, feeling its weight, its warmth from Tom's hand. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what else to say." "You don't have to say anything," Tom replied. "You just have to let us help. That's all we're asking." The kitchen door opened, and a woman emerged carrying a tray of food. Real food, hot and prepared with care. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread. The smell hit Shepard like a memory of a life he had abandoned. His stomach, used to soup kitchen meals and whatever he could scavenge, growled audibly. "When was the last time you had a home-cooked meal?" Sarah asked gently. Shepard thought about it. 20 years, he said finally. "Before I left. Before I ran." "Then eat," Sarah said. "No strings attached. No obligations. Just eat." He picked up the fork with hands that shook slightly. The first bite tasted like forgiveness, though he knew that was impossible, knew that food was just food. But sitting here, in this room full of veterans who understood, eating a meal prepared by people who cared, felt like the first step toward something he could not yet name. Crawford moved to sit beside him. "Sarge," he said quietly, "I want to show you something." He pulled out his phone and opened his photo gallery. "This is my family. My wife, Jessica. We've been married 23 years. These are my kids, William and Sarah. And these are my grandkids." He scrolled through images. Birthday parties, graduations, Christmas mornings. A whole life captured in pixels. A life that existed because Shepard had called in artillery fire danger clothes, had held a position for 6 hours, had refused to abandon his wounded. "None of this exists without you," Crawford said. "None of it. And you've been living in a tent thinking you didn't deserve to survive. But Sarge, look at these faces. My grandson is 4 years old. He loves dinosaurs and demands ice cream for breakfast. He exists because you saved my life. How is that not meaningful? How is that not worth your survival?" Shepard stared at the photos, at the smiling faces of people he had never met, but whose existence was somehow tied to the worst day of his life. "I never thought about it that way," he admitted. "I only thought about who didn't get to have this." "I know," Crawford said, "but they're both true. The men we lost didn't get these lives, and the men you saved did get them. Both things can be true at the same time." Nguyen joined them, pulling up a chair. "Sarge, I need to tell you something. After I lost my arm, I was angry. Angry at the Taliban, angry at the army, angry at you for calling in that fire. I blamed you for a long time." Shepard's jaw tightened. "I understand. You have every right. Let me finish," Nguyen said. "I blamed you until I adopted my kids. Until I held my daughter for the first time and realized she was alive because I was alive. And I was alive because you made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. That anger I carried, it was easier than accepting that sometimes there are no good choices. Only choices that cost everything and save what they can." He pulled out his own phone, showing pictures of 2 children, Afghan by features, American by opportunity. "This is Layla, and this is Hamid. Their parents were killed by the same people who ambushed us. I brought them home because you taught me that every life has value, that we fight for people. They're 16 and 14 now. Honor students. Layla wants to be a doctor. Hamid wants to join the army. They exist in freedom because you gave me the chance to be their father." The weight of it was staggering. Shepard had spent 20 years focused on 12 faces frozen in death. He had never allowed himself to see the lives that continued, that branched and grew and created new possibilities that rippled outward from that single day in Kuna Province. Yates sat down as well, completing the circle. "I don't have kids yet," he said, "but I've pulled 17 people from fires. 17 lives saved because you pulled me from under that Humvee. Some of them have kids. Some of them are kids. There's a little girl, maybe 6 years old now, who's alive because I got her out of a burning apartment. She draws me pictures, calls me her hero. But I'm not the hero in that story, Sarge. You are. Because without you, I'm not there to save her." Sarah Chun had been listening quietly, letting the men talk, letting Shepard absorb what they were telling him. Now she spoke with gentle firmness. "Sergeant Shepard, you've been operating under the belief that your survival was a betrayal of the men who died. But what if your survival was the last gift they gave you? What if holding that position, making those calls, doing everything you did, what if that was their final act of trust in you? They trusted you to lead them. And when leadership meant making the hardest choice imaginable, you made it. You didn't betray them. You honored them by doing what needed to be done." Shepard sat surrounded by his men, by evidence of lives saved and futures created, by the cascading consequences of survival. The dog tag still hung around his neck, 13 sets of metal that he had carried as weight for 20 years. But maybe they could be something else. Not anchors dragging him down, but reminders lifting him up. Reminders that he had tried, that he had fought, that he had brought home everyone he could. "I don't know if I can stop feeling guilty," he said quietly. "I don't know if that's possible." "You don't have to stop feeling it," Sarah said. "You just have to stop letting it be the only thing you feel. You can carry guilt and also feel gratitude for being alive. You can remember the fallen and also honor them by living well. Both things can exist together." Shepard looked down at the meal before him, still warm, still waiting. He took another bite, then another, letting himself taste it, letting himself acknowledge hunger and satisfaction, letting himself exist in the present moment instead of the past. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Not even close. But it was a beginning. 6 months had passed since that Memorial Day ceremony, when everything changed. Shepard still woke before dawn, muscle memory and decades of habit impossible to break. But now he woke in a small apartment above the VFW hall instead of a tent in the woods. Now he performed his push-ups and sit-ups on a floor instead of dirt. Now he showered in hot water and dressed in clean clothes that Tom Patterson's son would never wear again. The rituals remained. He still visited the graves every morning, still whispered the names of his 12 fallen brothers, still carried their dog tags against his chest. But the visits felt different now. Less like penance and more like remembrance. Less like punishment and more like honoring. He brought flowers sometimes, purchased with money from the part-time job Sarah had helped him find at the hardware store. Small acts of care instead of just apology. The nightmares had not stopped. Probably never would. He still saw Williams dying, still heard Mitchell's last scream, still felt the heat of the artillery he had called on his own position. But now, when he woke gasping in the dark, he did not face the horror alone. Now there were other veterans in the building, men and women who understood combat dreams, who sat with him in the early morning hours and shared coffee in silence until the memories receded enough to breathe again. Sarah Chun had been right about everything. The healing was not linear. Some days were better than others. Some days he could almost believe he deserved to be alive. Other days the guilt was so overwhelming he could barely function. But on those days, Crawford called, or Gwen stopped by, or Patricia Whitmore sent a text message that simply said, "Thinking of you today. Thank you for trying to save my boy." Small lifelines that kept him tethered to the present instead of drowning in the past. The video Sarah had recorded at the ceremony had gone viral in the veteran community. Not viral in the way of celebrity or fame, but viral in the way of recognition and connection. Other homeless veterans had reached out, had seen themselves in Shepard's story, had accepted help they had been refusing for years. The VFW had created a program specifically for combat veterans struggling with survivor's guilt, naming it Shepard's Watch. The irony of his name becoming synonymous with care instead of failure was not lost on him. This morning, the morning of Memorial Day 1 year after he had been found, Shepard stood in front of the mirror in his apartment. He wore the clothes Tom Patterson had given him. Clean jeans, a button-down shirt, the Marine jacket that had belonged to a man he never met but who had served with the same honor Shepard was learning to recognize in himself. The dog tag still hung around his neck, all 13 sets, but they felt lighter now. Not weightless, never weightless, but lighter. His beard was trimmed, his hair cut short in a style that made him look more like the sergeant he had been than the homeless man he had become. The face in the mirror was still weathered, still marked by time and trauma, but the eyes looked different. Less haunted, less distant, more present. There was a knock on his door. He opened it to find Crawford standing there with his entire family. His wife Jessica, his son William, who carried Shepard's first name, his daughter Sarah, named after the VFW director who had saved them both in different ways, and 3 grandchildren who looked at this old man with curious eyes that did not see failure or guilt, only their grandfather's friend. "Ready, Sarge?" Crawford asked. "Big day today." Shepard nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be." They walked together to the town square where the memorial stood. But this year, everything was different. The crowd was larger, drawn by news coverage of last year's ceremony, and by word spreading through the veteran community that this town understood what Memorial Day actually meant. The mayor was there, but standing in the background instead of front and center. Gerald Winters was there too, helping set up chairs with genuine humility instead of self-importance. At the memorial wall, all 12 families of Shepard's fallen soldiers had gathered. Patricia Whitmore stood with her husband and her grandchildren who had never met Uncle Jimmy but knew his story. The Williams family had traveled from 3 states away. The Morales family brought flowers for Ricardo's name. All of them together, united not just by loss, but by the connection to the man who had led their sons and brothers in a battle and carried them in his heart ever since. Sarah Chin approached Shepard with a gentle smile. "There's someone here who wants to meet you," she said. She gestured toward a young woman in her mid-20s, standing nervously at the edge of the crowd. She has dark skin and her father's eyes. Deshaun Williams' daughter. Aaliyah. Shepard's breath caught. The baby girl whose name Williams had tried to say as he died. Now grown. Now here. He walked toward her on unsteady legs, Crawford supporting his elbow, and when he reached her, she was crying before he could say a word. "You held my father when he died," she said, her voice breaking. "You promised him you'd tell me he loved me. My mother told me that story my whole life. That his sergeant held him and promised to remember." "I did promise," Shepard said, "and I kept that promise. Every single day for 20 years. Aaliyah pulled out her phone and showed him a picture. Her wedding day, 6 months ago. In her hands, she held a photograph of her father in uniform, carried down the aisle because he could not walk beside her. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that I became a teacher, like my dad wanted to be. I teach 2nd grade. 23 students this year. I tell them about my father every Memorial Day, about his service, about his sacrifice, about the sergeant who held him so he didn't die alone." Shepard could not speak, could only nod, could only let this young woman, this embodiment of the future Deshaun Williams never got to see, wrap her arms around him in an embrace that felt like absolution he had not earned but was being given anyway. The ceremony began. This year, Shepard stood with the color guard by invitation and acceptance instead of confrontation and exclusion. This year, when it came time to read the names of the fallen, he was asked to read the 12 names he knew by heart. He stood at the microphone with the entire town listening and spoke each name clearly, adding a sentence for each one that the official record would never capture. Corporal James Whitmore. He wanted to be a teacher. He loved basketball and terrible jokes. Private First Class Deshaun Williams. He carried a picture of his baby daughter in his helmet. He died asking me to tell her he loved her. Specialist Ricardo Morales. He sent money home to his mother every month. He could fix anything. He continued through all 12, giving them back their humanity, making them more than names on granite, honoring them as the people they had been instead of just the sacrifice they had made. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Then Patricia Whitmore began to clap, slowly at first, then joined by the other families, then by the entire crowd. Not applause for him, but for them, for the fallen, for the remembering, for the truth that service was about people, not abstractions. After the ceremony, Shepard stood at the wall and placed his hand on each name. But this time, instead of whispering apologies, he whispered updates. Still here, Jimmy. Still trying. Your mom is doing okay. She smiles when she talks about you now, instead of just crying. Still here, Deshawn. Your daughter is a teacher, brother. Just like you wanted to be. She's teaching kids to be kind. Still here, Ricardo. Your family remembers. They're proud of you. Crawford stood beside him. You doing okay, Sarge? Getting there, Shepard said. Still hard. Still hurts. But I'm learning that honoring them doesn't mean destroying myself. I'm learning to carry them differently. They stood together in silence, sergeant and soldier, survivor and survivor, both marked by the same day, but choosing different futures. Around them, families mingled and children played, and the town continued its Memorial Day celebration with genuine understanding of what they were celebrating. Sarah Chan approached with a young man in his early 20s, clearly nervous, clearly military by his bearing. Sergeant Shepard, she said, this is Private Lucas Morrison. He just returned from his first deployment. Afghanistan. He's struggling with some things. Wondering if maybe you could talk to him, if you're willing. Shepard looked at this young soldier with haunted eyes that he recognized in his own mirror. Saw the guilt beginning to form. Saw the isolation starting to calcify. Saw the path toward 20 years in a tent already being walked. And he understood that maybe this was why he had survived. Not to punish himself. Not to suffer alone. But to be here for moments like this. To help other veterans before they disappeared the way he had. I'm willing, Shepard said. Let's talk. And whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. I learned that the hard way. Let me help you learn it easier. They walked together toward the VFW hall, veteran and veteran, survivor offering hope to survivor. Behind them, the flag flew at full staff, the ceremony complete, the fallen honored. And Shepard, for the first time in 20 years, allowed himself to believe that maybe his survival meant something beyond guilt. Maybe it meant he could help carry others through the darkness he had navigated alone for so long. Still here, brothers, he thought as he walked. Still trying. Still remembering. And finally learning to live. For them. For the 6 you saved. For the veterans who need someone who understands. For the life you didn't want but were given anyway. Still here. And that's enough. For today, that's enough.